Hello everyone. Today we'll do something slightly different. We're talking normally about ships and games in World of Warships, but today we'll be talking about ships purely, historically, because this is the HMAS Vampire in the Sydney Harbour in the Maritime Museum, and she's a Daring class destroyer. These were destroyers that were built for the Royal Australian Navy. The Vampire was laid down in 1956 and has been in active service until the 1980s when she was transferred over to the museum. And since then, this is where she sits, in Sydney, in the Maritime Museum. So I took the opportunity to take a bit of a video. They had 4.5 inch or 113 millimeter main guns, 2 turret forward, and 1 turret aft, and they had 40mm Bofors for the medium range AA. You see some shells here. This is the kind of stuff they would be firing. So going onto the ship, here in the center, this is where the torpedo launcher was sitting previously, but during various refits, she was a training ship at some point. The torpedo launchers were removed. And next to her is HMAS Advance, an attack class patrol boat. That's also part of the museum, but I think she's currently not open for visit. Because of COVID, I couldn't go below deck, so we're just, going to walk on top. So here in the rear, there used to be the anti-submarine Hedgehog launcher mortar, and this has all been removed, and there was some training rooms were added, because she was for a while actually a training ship, before she became an actual museum ship. And there we see the rear turret. Now, during her duties, she had several refits, and some of the AA had been removed, but they've put the twin Bofors back, and you can kind of see them there next to the rear turret. But yeah, these are the 113mm rear guns. Given that it's a destroyer, there's probably not too much armor on these things, but it's still very impressive to stand next to one, because even if it's just 113mm, imagine how big turrets would be that are actually large calibers. And these were the twin 40mm Bofors that were mounted. The Bofors 40s were invented in Sweden, developed from a base of the British pom-poms. And these were 40mm autocannons for AA defense. Now, like I said, they had been removed at some point, but again, they put them back for the museum ship. There was actually some interesting things about the Bofors. The original version had a reflex sight, but the British actually used an analog tracking computer in order to track low-flying targets, because the Bofors were aimed at effective at around about 3,000 meters. So it was quite difficult for manual tracking against dive bombers. There is a little dinghy or barge, motorboat that can be sent over the side, and that's still hanging on the side here. Moving on, we're coming towards the catwalk that connects the two parts of the superstructure. Again, in the original build, there used to be a torpedo launcher down here, but that had been removed when torpedoes were not really the main thing anymore, and now you have this very thin walkway to get across. She did have radar. Again, the ship was active between the 1950s and the 1980s, so she's got a full sets of radars, sonars, and everything else. Now walking towards the bow section, we're passing by a lot of the superstructure. You used to be able to access the areas below deck, and one thing that the Australians did that was very different from how the British had it was that they wanted air conditioning. And we'll get back to that in a later point, because that is somewhat interesting. So here's the lower forward turret, and you can, there's the bow and the anchor chains and all those things. And that would have been the view if you were standing at the bow of the ship. She's actually not that huge, if you consider that a fair amount of people had to live and work on these ships and on the sea. And these guns are, again, really impressive if you see them up close. You'd think of them as, well, I guess relatively small, but these actually look really, really impressive on these turrets. And there you see the second turret, which is super firing to the first one, obviously. She has actually fired her guns in anger, but we'll get to that in a minute as well. You can see that red box below. these seem to be controls to flood the magazines, which, if the ship happens to be on fire, then you can use these controls from over here to actually flood the shell rooms and the magazines. Now going up the superstructure towards the bridge. The original Vampire had an open bridge, and a lot of the superstructure here that we see today is from the various refits. And here we get a bit of a view inside the turret. That must have been extremely scary to be inside that during a gunfight and not knowing what's going on outside. Up there's the bridge. Again, like I said, originally the bridge was open, but during one of the refits, she has acquired a closed bridge, so you don't get rained on. Now you cannot go below deck because of COVID, but you can get inside the bridge area. And there's the captain's seat, all the instruments, navigational charts, and all those things. So this is where they would have been standing while on the seas, and this would have been their view out from, forward from the ship. Coming out the other side, we can kind of take a look from outside, outside the bridge, towards the bow. And down there, again on the left side, we see one of the Bofors. And these are the forward-facing single-mount Bofors. She also had a bunch of, I think, Vickers machine guns for point defense, but these have been removed. It's just the 40mm that are still there. So I've been looking around trying to figure out if the turrets were super firing. It kind of looks like a little bit that they can at least aim upwards, so I wouldn't be surprised, especially that 113mm is a decent caliber for like heavy AA. And again, from a close-up point of view, these are the 113s. Now here it gets a little interesting, because if we look at this, these are the battle honors. Actually, these are not all the battle honors, but these are battle honors from the Second World War. Wait a minute, you said that the Vampire was built was built in 1956, yes. But the way this works with battle honors, from what I understand, at least in the British and in the Commonwealth system, is that they get inherited. So this is not the first HMAS Vampire. There was a Vampire before her. And that Vampire was built in 1917, a V-class destroyer for the British Navy, just towards the end of the First World War. Eventually handed over to the Australian Navy in order to, strengthen a little bit the naval power. And just before the outbreak of the Second World War, she was transferred together with a bunch of other Australian destroyers to the Mediterranean. These, by a certain Mr. Goebbels, was called the Scrap Iron Flotilla. And if you know anything about Australians, derogative terms or curses are actually seen as endearment. So we totally took that on and were proud of it to be the Scrap Iron Flotilla. They were the Vampire was mainly busy in the Mediterranean doing escort duties, and going back to the battle honors, we see a fair bit of this, right? So we do see the Mediterranean Sea honor from 1940, Battle of Calabria. We see Greece, so the evacuation of Greece, the evacuation of Crete in 1941. And she was also part of the so-called Tobruk ferry when urgently needed supplies were brought to Libya in order to stop Rommel from overrunning everybody. And these destroyers were actually ferrying explosives, ammunition, food, all kinds of supplies under constant air attack from both the Germans and the Italians. And HMAS Vampire was part of that group and was under fire ferrying things over. Now, in 1941, and remember I said something about the air conditioning. In 1941, the British had a bit of a problem because the Japanese were, about to enter war. And the British strategy around Singapore had most of the time been roundabout, we know the Japanese are going to be a problem, but it's fine. We can just send the a large enough part of the home fleet over there, and then we're just going to barricade and embargo the Japanese and cut off their trade and sink their ships, and then they'll give up, and then everything's good. Now, obviously, this relied on a couple of things. First of all, this relied on the French keeping the Italians in check in the Mediterranean. And they were also banking on the Americans to help out as well. Now, in reality, it looked very, very different because the British were very busy against the Germans in the Atlantic. The French had surrendered, and the British had actually been fighting the French in order to sink their ships, which means they also now had to deal with the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. And, well, the Americans got attacked in Pearl Harbor. So a lot of the American Pacific Fleet was at the bottom of Pearl Harbor or under construction. So they didn't really have much in order to counter the Japanese. Still, they didn't want to give up on that idea because they got so used to the thought. And obviously Australia being part of the Commonwealth and a couple of more holdings needed to be secured in some way. So Churchill decided to send HMS Prince of Wales, a King George V battleship, which was pretty modern at the time, and HMS Repulse, a battle cruiser, which was somewhat older, to strengthen the eastern force in Singapore, in the port, and, to do something about the Japanese. Now, this was before the British accepted that airplanes were actually a problem for ships. Because until then, the idea was, well, look, Prince of Wales has a very substantial amount of modern anti-aircraft systems. And from our experiences so far in the Mediterranean, we've had a lot of air attacks, but sinking something like a battleship hasn't really happened. Pearl Harbor hadn't happened yet. The Japanese, on the other hand, were fully aware of what the British were doing. So they were specifically training torpedo bombers to do low passes and do anti-ship attacks, which was not something that was extremely widely known or popular at the time. So when the British sailed out as part of Force Z, the HMS Repulse and the HMS Prince of Wales, Vampire was actually an escort for the Repulse. And, as it happened, they did get caught by the Japanese from the air, and both the Repulse and the Prince of Wales were sunk by air attacks. They were both torpedoed, and Vampire survived, but ended up picking up a lot of survivors from one of these ships. So in the end, Singapore was overrun, and the British had to retreat towards Ceylon, which was their remaining base and what they had left to dominate and secure India and keep the Indian Ocean under control. The Japanese then were a little bit overstretched already because the Americans had started pushing back, and they briefly considered linking up with the Germans in the Middle East, but they just became too stretched and needed resources elsewhere. But they did end up sending a relatively large carrier force to strike in the so-called Indian Ocean raid. And at the time, Vampire was escorting the Hermes, a relatively obsolete aircraft carrier. And when it became apparent that the Japanese were going to attack, these two were setting out, such as they wouldn't be caught in port. But the Japanese caught up with them and managed to sink both the Hermes and the Vampire. So that's where we get these battle honors from. So the Malaya 1941 and 42 were the actions where she was part of the Eastern Force and eventually was sunk. Now, the one that's not mentioned here on the plaque is the one from the newer Vampire, the Daring Vampire, which is actually a battle honor of her own from the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, where she did some patrols and gave some fire supports to troops on the ground. And that's pretty much the only time that she actually used her guns in anger. Here we can take a very quick look below deck into the engine room. And again, like I said, because of COVID, we can't go anywhere down. But just briefly of what I mentioned about the air conditioning. So the Prince of Wales had a very modern anti-aircraft system. The problem was it was warm because she was sailing in tropical waters. And it didn't work very well. The people they didn't have air conditioning or sufficient air conditioning. The crew was extremely fatigued. And the AA ammunition was not in a good state as well. So the absence of AA has somewhat contributed to the loss of these two ships. But yeah, that is the HMAS Vampire, the Daring class destroyer, and the largest museum piece in Australia. So yeah, thanks everybody. And let me know if you like this kind of format. I've got a couple more ideas of what I want to do, mainly exploring military sites and objects around where I'm living, but definitely also going to check out some other things. That's it for today. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you next time. Bye.